Hello and welcome everyone to our webinar today. I'm Rachel Paul with IAAP. We're happy to have you joining us for EU versus US, a comparison of standards and regulations. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping items to go over. We do have closed captioning available. You can select the closed captioning icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will also be sharing stream text links for captions available in French, German, Spanish, and Swedish. We do have microphones muted to prevent any background noise or disruptions, and the chat will be monitored for any dialogue and technical issues, and you're welcome to post your questions in the Q&A throughout. And we'll also be sharing a link to attend a follow-up drop-in session if you'd like to continue the discussion after the webinar. And I'm happy to turn today's program over to Susanna Laurin. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you very much. So just for the translations that we do on all the EU webinars, I wanted to ask Rachel to post the links in the chat and also to describe what it is. Vous pouvez lire les sous-titres en français si vous suivez le lien fourni dans le Chat. Sie können das auf Deutsch lesen, wenn Sie dem im Chat angegebenen Link folgen. Puedes leer el español si sigues el enlace provisto en el chat. Du kan läsa texten på svenska om du klickar på länken som vi lägger i chatten. And I will stop there, so this won't take forever. In the European Commission usually calls this the Eurovision of accessibility, and I think that's kind of cool. So let's continue be the Eurovision of this whole thing. So today's speakers are myself. I'm usually not speaking on these webinars. I'm invited really clever people to do the presentations, but today I'm joined by my old friend and a fantastic speaker called Katie, and I've learned how to say this. Haritos, Shea.
Yeah, that works.
The Senior Product Manager, Accessibility Compliance Subject Matter Expert, the world's longest title, but that is just to cover all her fantastic capabilities. So thank you, Katie, for being here, waking up very early in the morning to provide the US part of this presentation. I'm so happy to have you with us.
Thank you very much. I'm real happy to be here with you. You know that.
Okay, so we have a slight problem, and that is that when preparing for this, we realized we have like a 3-hour training material. So we'll try to do this in a short period of time. We only have 1 hour. We will try to do the presentation in 40-ish minutes, and then we are open for questions, of course. And again, we have the drop-in sessions next week, so that if you want to continue the discussion, you're also welcome to join us there. So just a couple of words on this setup. The idea for this is, of course, that IAAP is a truly global organization. We have members in more than 70 countries, and two of the big chunks of members come from either the EU or North America. And we think that because so many people are working on both sides of the pond, we really want to make sure that we understand each other a little bit better and try to clarify some things around the different legislations and standards that we kind of use on both sides of the Atlantic, but still have a little bit different approaches around. So that was the idea. And I know Katie is also working from the US, but also for clients that work in the EU as well. So the agenda for today is really to talk about the two ecosystems, the coverage of the legislation in the US and EU, comparing the requirements that both regions use, something around the exceptions, which is the most difficult thing to say for me in English, but we will talk about it. I'll leave it to Katie if I can't say it. The EN 301549, which is European standard that the EU-wide legislation points to, and the Section 508 standards in the US. The conformance reporting, how we do that in the different regions, feedback and complaints, how that is handled. Enforcement, of course, very important, and then our suggestion for global compliance. So that is the main takeaways from this, hopefully from both of us, and of course the Q&A. So this looks really long, but I promise you we'll try to keep it as short as we can. But there are a lot of details, so please bear with us if we don't cover exactly what you want to know about this. Then we'll be happy to answer any questions. So the two ecosystems, trying to compare these two beasts is difficult, and we are not covering everything in this presentation. We try to do the things where we think the similarities are happening most often, and or where people have most questions around the differences. So in the EU, the governments are covered by the Procurement Directive and the Web Accessibility Directive, whereas the private industry is going to be covered by the European Accessibility Act, which enters into force in 2025. So I'm only going to talk about the EU-wide legislations and standards today, and all the member states, they also have discrimination acts, and they have loads of other accessibility legislation that you also need to understand if you're working in the member states. But today I'm only focusing on the EU-wide directives.
Yeah, and go ahead. Did you want to go ahead? Okay, so in the US, relative to those standards that and laws that apply to governments and industries that work with government, is the Rehabilitation Act, Section 508, and the Telecommunications Act, 255. And then to cover private industries and states, we have the very broad law of Americans with Disabilities Act. And there are many titles, but the most important ones for this discussion are Title II about states and Title III for private industry. So private industry covers companies like I work for, but on the other hand, we have governments that are clients. So we need to provide for their requirements, which is where the importance of Section 508.
Did I lose Katie, or did I lose everything?
It appears just to be Katie we have lost.
Yep.
See if we get her back here, give her.
Yeah. So in the meantime, we will play a little bit of music. No, we won't, but I think kind of on a general level, what you can say about the two different ways of doing accessibility legislation is a little bit on how the enforcement is made, and also the monitoring piece. I think that is one of the most important differences, that we don't sue each other to that extent in Europe. So it's not that much about money or avoiding getting in trouble in court, but more a shame culture where you don't want to be hung as or shown as being a bad behaving agency and so on. So that is one of the differences in kind of the driving force in the two regions. And when it comes to the equivalence to, oh, here we have Katie again. Good. We lost you, but you did say Title III private industry before you froze. So I don't know if that was you are muted now.
Okay, wow, technical problem. So, okay, I did say that. And so what I meant is that, so as an individual company, we have to pay attention to what we're required to do, but as our clients are often governments, one sort or another, federal, state, or local, we need to be ensure that we're meeting their requirements. And federal, state, and local have adopted Section 508. So we have to meet more than just the requirements for industry. For our clients that are government clients, is from police departments to the state of California. We need to be sure that we provide their requirements when we provide products and services for them that are ICT.
Yeah, true. And that's, of course, the same in Europe, that ICT suppliers that want to sell to public sector need to understand their requirements as well. So that I think is a similarity. And also important to understand in the EU legal system, when the EU decides on a directive, that means that we have minimum requirements in all member states, but the member states are also allowed to go beyond these requirements. So there are also differences, even if we have the same core legislation, there are still differences between the member states. That is also important to know if you are making business in the EU. So when it comes to the coverage, the procurement directive in Europe isn't as strong as the other acts and directives. So the procurement directive makes it possible to add requirements on accessibility, and also in theory, at least, possible to make complaints and so on. But that is a very toothless directive, unfortunately. So I will focus today on the Web Accessibility Directive, which is a much stronger and more used directive in the member states. So the Web Accessibility Directive covers websites, intranet, extranets, documents published on these sites, and also apps. The scope of the directive is all public sector agencies and also what we call bodies governed by public law. And that is a very legal term, but it means organizations that may be a foundation or private or whatever legal status they have. But if they are more than 50% funded by or run by government on state level or regional level, then they are seen as a body governed by public law. And that means that I mean, public sector is also big in the EU compared to the US, and because we also add this kind of gray zone around it, it's huge. So no one knows how many digital interfaces are covered by the Web Accessibility Directive, because no one has managed to understand how to count them. But one estimation is around 7 million websites, and then to that add to the intranet, extranets, apps, and so on. So a lot. And of course, again, it indirectly affects also the ICT suppliers that want to sell to public sector because of their huge purchasing power.
And Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act law additionally, similarly covers all government agencies, federal government agencies, which the US federal government sort of is at the top. But it also covers, like Susanna said, for the Web Accessibility Directive, it covers organizations that are mainly funded by the government, which is a lot of organizations and public universities and things like that. And then, of course, it says it informs the states, but what that means is that the states have actually adopted Section 508 for their own. And like she said, they also, they can have a higher requirement. There were states that took on WCAG before the Section 508 was updated, things like that. So, but the thing is that it covers the entire IT infrastructure as opposed to just web and intranet. It covers networking and covers telecommunications and covers any aspect of the flow through of data through government agencies. So, so that's internal for employees, external for citizens. So that's the big difference there. And then for the pieces that aren't really covered, Section 508 complaints and things can work with the ADA to accomplish some of the things that the private industry does. That's it.
Yeah,
next slide.
And if you compare the requirements in the Web Accessibility Directive, this is also a big difference. So we in the EU, the law is one piece of meat, and then the standard is something else. And that means that even if the legislative process take long, of course it always does, then the standards can actually move a little faster, even if standardization is not super fast either, but at least we have a chance to update. So that is why we now have different levels in across the Atlantic. So every European EU directive needs to point to a European standard, not the global WCAG system, but a European one. So the minimum requirements of presumed conformance of the directives in Europe is the EN 301549. The EN stands for European norm. So EN 301549. And we are now at version 3.2.1. So it's very clear that the versions move much faster than the legislation does. And I think that makes it also possible for us to keep a little bit more up to date with the technical development and so on. But of course, having said that, we want to have our own standards, so to speak, or we have to for legal reasons. We of course, don't want to reinvent the wheel or invent something different than the rest of the world. That would be really stupid. So when it comes to the web, the EN standard is referring to or harmonizing with the WCAG 2.1 AA standard. So it's still basically the same, but the EN goes broader. And it's interesting that Katie says that the US regulations cover all ICT, because that is also true for the EN standard. So we have the requirements for all ICT, but then when it comes to the legal parts, that is a smaller portion, at least for now. So another difference is that the authoring tools are not covered in the EU, which I think is a bad thing. We always also have in the EN standard the functional performance statements that covers the kind of the user need parts, and that is very important because those user needs are always listed, and when it comes to monitoring and the things you are supposed to make sure that you meet. So the functional performance statements are important, but the actual requirements are listed in an annex of the EN standard. I'll get back to that later on. One good thing of the EN standard is that we have also managed finally to get the WCAG 2.1 AAA version level included in the standard. It's only informative, it's not part of the minimum requirements, but it's there. And that was a big step forward, at least in my view. So that is something we're proud of.
I would very much agree. So the Section 508 law identified that we have this great organization called the U.S. Access Board that is required to write the Section 508 standards and to update them on a regular basis. And that update took a whole long time because WCAG itself took a whole long time. So the 2018 version, 2017-2018 version basically covers all ICT. And it identified WCAG 2.0 AA. 2.1 wasn't around then. But it does have authoring tool requirements that come from the W3C's authoring tool requirements. And that's a really important piece because anything that creates other content, the tool itself should be accessible and the output of that tool should be accessible. And that ranges anywhere from an SDK that developers use to from Microsoft. So that we have the functional performance criteria as well, but they're not used together. They're only used if for some reason you cannot meet the technical requirements required by the standard. And then in the standard itself, it incorporates 8 different standards. So it incorporates by reference is what it's called. And therefore, again, we didn't want to write any original stuff when there was already good things out there. And so the usability standard, HFES, WCAG, and the PDF UA, and several other standards that have to do with more physical hardware things. So that is sort of the broad piece. The other thing that the Section 508 required was for it to be incorporated into what's called the Federal Register, which is the procurement tool, the rule book that the federal government has for purchasing and using things. It's a huge, big book, and then all of the different kinds of requirements fall under there. So it is basically a procurement requirement. The government understanding that through procurement is how they, sort of control, can have a handle on things and be consistent with them.
Okay, so now we come to the thing that I can't say, exemptions and exceptions. So
you do fine.
in Europe, in the Web Accessibility Directive, that doesn't cover the public sector broadcasters. That is not because they are not important, but it's because they are usually covered by other laws and regulations and also many national ones. So we don't want them to be in conflict or overlapping too much. Also, certain charities, even if they are partly or to a majority funded by the government, still they can be excluded for several reasons. So if the charity is not, or the NGO is not providing specific services to people with disabilities, then they of course are covered, but otherwise many of the NGOs are not covered. The exceptions are for now things that seem to be either technically not feasible or very expensive to solve. So online maps that are made for navigation is not part of the regulations yet. third-party content, because the public agency can't really know what people are providing if they have a chat or something like that. Really old legacy documents from archives and things that existed before the directive entered into force. It's kind of normal procedure. Don't use your resources in looking back, but try to make things good in the future instead. There are some exceptions from this exception, and that is if you have an old PDF with instructions for how to use a service that is running right now, then it needs to be accessible even if the instructions were made before the legislation. So small details, but anyway. And then live video is also not covered by the legislation, and that is because at the time when the law was written, the captions were really expensive, and the automatic captions didn't really work in all languages and so on. So that is one of the pieces that I personally think will be reviewed and maybe added in the next generation of the directive, but right now it's not covered. But if you do record something live and then put it on the website, so after 14 days it's deemed pre-recorded, so then you need to caption it anyway. And then why don't do it in the first place, because nobody wants to kind of read yesterday's news. So hopefully that is not used as an excuse. Also, if something that should be accessible isn't accessible, then the users have the right to ask for it in an alternative format. So that is part of the legislation, part of the rights from the users. And there's also a possibility, of course, to if the public administration thinks that this would cost us $1 million to fix, or we are doing an update next year and then it will be fixed. So it would be really not taking good care of taxpayers' money to spend all this money now when we can do it in a couple of months or so on. So you can always claim disproportionate burden, but you have to have a good reason, and it's on you to prove why this is deemed to be disproportionate.
In Section 508, the exemptions and exceptions don't necessarily make a lot of sense anymore. I mean, this law has been in place since 2001, and all these are basically the same. Having worked with Department of Defense agencies, the exception for national security systems is only for systems that control weapons. So the payroll and everything else that goes on in the Department of Defense is not exempt, or any other agency is only if it's a system that controls weapons systems. The exceptions are if there best means is if there's nothing that exists in the marketplace that meets the requirements. You have to choose the one that's going to best meet the requirements. So that's an important thing, because procurement folks are supposed to be looking at 3 different things that meet the business requirement, and choose the one most accessible content, even if it's more expensive. Sorry. Fundamental alteration is if what you are trying to use, you have to make something different to make it meet these requirements. That is also an exception. And a back office IT with no user interface. These are used so rarely. Alternate means, equivalent facilitation. The great thing about equivalent facilitation is that it says if you can find a better way to meet these requirements, like say WCAG 2.1 instead of WCAG 2.0, you can do that. And so that's something that's important to know about this requirement. And then undue burden is the similar thing that Susanna talked about, the disproportionate burden clause, and that is also used extremely rarely by any organization, because it's not business as usual. Organizations, companies, manufacturers have been building to accessibility for some time, because the US government is one of the largest purchasers of IT in the world, and so they want to sell to them. And so to sell to them, they need to meet the requirements.
I hope and foresee that also the disproportionate burden will be used mostly in the beginning of the lifetime of the directive, and less and less. So I hope I can get back to you in a year and say that is happening already. Yeah. So just very quickly about the organization of chapters in the EN standard. I know I'm part of the task force writing this. So if you find it extremely difficult to read or too long or everything, you can please complain to me. I'm not the only one to blame, but still, I think it's important to have kind of the overview. So just really quickly, the beginning is the scope, the references, the definitions and abbreviations, the first chapters. I think you can kind of skip them or just read them if you're very interested. But the heart of the standard, what I really would like everyone to read is the functional performance chapter. So that is, I think, where we try to explain everything. And if you only have time or energy to read one thing, that is at least a good place to start to get, probably everyone listening to this webinar already know this, but I mean, for the general audience, I think this is the most important part. Then we have the generic requirements that goes kind of on top or horizontal over everything, all ICT, that is. So some of them are more important than others if we're talking about the web. And then we have the ICT with two-way voice communication, a very kind of narrow chapter. Also ICT with video capabilities, also quite narrow. And the hardware piece, which is of course more for ATMs and elevators and whatever. That is also covered, but not really for the Accessibility Directive. And then, everything came at once. So then we have chapter 9, which is the web, chapter 10, non-web documents, chapter 11, software. All of these bits and pieces are, of course, covered by the minimum requirements in the directive. And then we have the document and support services. That is kind of looking forward to more to the European Accessibility Act, because this is something that is specifically covered in the new generation legislation that we get in a couple of years, where emergency services is a big piece, and then and also support services. So both chapter 12 and 13, the ICT providing relay or emergency services access, is really a preparation for the next generation legislation. The most interesting part, I think, in the EN are the annexes. So Annex A is a list of the requirements for the minimum requirements of the Web Accessibility Directive. So this is it's a table, and if you kind of check all the lines of this, then you know that you are conformant to the legislation. Annex B is extremely useful for procurers, and this is what we always use when we train procurers, because this is kind of the connection of the functional performance statements with the technical requirements. And you can also see if for each group and for each requirement, which is primary, which means that it's absolutely necessary, and if it's secondary, so it's not nice to have, it's more than that, but it's not kind of life and death differences. So that is really, really helpful if you want to pick among the 3 tenders that you got, and none of them is perfect, then you need to kind of balance or prioritize, and then Annex B is really helpful in doing that, so that you can compare in a good way based on the user needs and how they meet the requirements. Annex C is the determination of compliance, so no news for anyone who knows accessibility. Annex D is the famous AAA success criteria, and Annex E is my personal baby, which is the guidance for users. So the Annex E is quite new. It came in the previous version, and it is the idea is to have something in the standard that is actually written for humans. So hopefully this is a helpful document to make sure that you understand how to use the standard if it's kind of too cumbersome to read the whole thing.
Having written technical standards, I understand exactly what you're talking about. So real quickly, I want to identify the structure of the Section 508 standard. It's basically a headache slide, but I want to just very simply frame this for you to understand it in a very broad fashion. Could you hit enter, please? So there's 3 appendixes in this particular standard. The Appendix A is about Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, which is applicable, like I said, to the federal government, but states and other governments have adopted this. So keep going. So that's good. So Chapter 1 has got the basic stuff about exceptions and definitions and referenced standards. The next Chapter 2 is scoping, what things it covers. So how you apply this, what the exceptions are, what the functional performance criteria are, the explanation for electronic content, what is hardware, what is software as far as this standard is concerned, and then the support documented services. The second appendix is Section 255 of the Communications Act. So, and this is for manufacturers, and so these are the same type of chapters, exactly the same applications, how you apply this law and the scoping of this law to the technical standards, which are on the right, which is going to be Appendix C. And that's sort of the meat of this. So A is Section 508, B is Section 255, these laws, and how we apply them to everything on the right, the technical standards, and the functional performance criteria if you cannot meet the technical standards. So the functional performance criteria is very important about how different needs are necessary for people with different disabilities. Then chapter that covers, all ICT, that is hardware, and things that are closed functionality, like your cell phone, the biometrics and those kinds of things. And then the software section covers web, non-web documents, and software. And this is where it identifies that you can use WCAG 2.0 in this chapter. Please hit enter again. One of the things that's really important about this is that it must work with the assistive technologies that people with disabilities use. I think that's really important. The differences about how you deal with applications, and then of course the authoring tool requirements. Chapter 6 covers support services and documents. So it's very important that whatever you have to help the user has to be in an accessible format. And then when someone contacts the agency or the organization, they have to be able to support the user in the fashion that they need to be supported and provide documentation in an accessible fashion. So if they need video relay, if they need something in Braille, they should be able to get it. And then finally, chapter 7 is those standards I said were incorporated by reference. This is where WCAG, human factors, the PDF standard, and all the physical standards are included by reference, saying you can use these standards to additionally meet the requirements. So the big change for this Section 508 is that it incorporates usability with accessibility. Many of us know from experience that something could be accessible, but totally unusable with 480 links on the page. So next slide, please. And then this is just well, no, it was back. Go back one, please.
Sorry.
That's it. This is the full headache standard. And I just wanted you to, hopefully it's not quite as complicated. A and B are the two different laws, how you apply it to all the technical stuff on the right. Therefore, basically the technical stuff on the right isn't enough things you need to worry about. Done, thank you.
Thank you, Katie. That's impressive. Whew. Hard to click on the right place. So let's move on to the conformance reporting. So in the Web Accessibility Directive, all public sector agencies are required to have an accessibility statement. And this is really important because not only is this a document like a self-declaration piece, but to be able to tell the world how accessible my content is, I need to know how accessible it is. So it actually requires me to do some testing or to know what I'm doing, requirements, testing, controlling. This could be done in many ways, internally or externally, but I need to know the status of my website or app before I write my accessibility statement. And this will be monitored, so I can't just lie. So that's an important part of the reporting. It's also required in this statement to have the feedback mechanism. And I think this is one of the coolest things of the directive, because this means that the end users have a right to give you feedback. And if the users are constructive and nice to you, then this is kind of, wow, it's a gift. You get for free consultation. You don't need to call us to be helped. You can get the help directly from the users. Of course, this is not putting pressure on the users to kind of fix it, because it's the responsibility is still on the public sector. But I know from experience that many of the smaller organizations, they actually don't know that they have accessibility problems. So this feedback mechanism is extremely important. And as long as the user is providing feedback, that's an issue between he or she and the agency, and they are supposed to fix things either by remediation or alternative formats. And that's all fine and should be done in a nice manner. But if the public sector agency doesn't answer within 2 weeks, then the user can have, or doesn't answer in a way that the user thinks is good enough, then there is also a requirement to have a link to the complaints tool. And the complaints tool or the complaints mechanism is usually done by the same agency as does the monitoring. It could also be a separate one. It could be an ombudsman. Looks a little bit different in the different member states, but there is always one official agency that take care of complaints from users. So if you don't get what you need from your public sector agency, then you are allowed to make a formal complaints, and that way it will be controlled then by the monitoring body.
So in the United States, the Section 508 uses the VPAT and ACR, Accessibility Compliance Report, sort of like the accessibility statement. How are we going to know that this organization is accessible when they're making a procurement? And so industry and government got together and created this thing called a VPAT, which is basically just a listing of what the technical requirements are. It's available in a US version, a European version, and an international version, and just a plain WCAG version. And basically, this is the thing that the procurement officer is supposed to look at when they're comparing three products, because they will all have the same, they have a format, and it needs to use that format and use the recommended language in that format. So similar to what the accessibility statement is for the Web Accessibility Directive. And then the procurement agents must include these accessibility requirements in any of their solicitations and contracts. And by including the VPAT as part of that contract, if for some reason, which might have happened early on, that vendors lied about their level of accessibility, other vendors can sue the government because they know that they had presented a VPAT that showed that more accessibility, and there's that action. And then of course users could sue as well. So there's it's recommended to have feedback and so on, but it's a different sort of thing. The conformance reporting is really each agency is supposed to record what its level of accessibility is, and a report is supposed to be made to Congress and the president every 2 years. Didn't exactly work out like that, but anyway, let's keep going.
Yeah, so I think the big difference here is that the accessibility statement is done by the municipality, the region, the national agency. So that is the public sector agency reporting, where the VPAT is more on the vendor side or the supplier side. So that is maybe the most important difference between those two systems. So around feedback and complaints, slightly repetitive, but still. So in the Web Accessibility Directive, we have this feedback mechanism and the complaints mechanism, and there is a possibility if you still don't do what you're supposed to do, and if you don't follow the regulations as you should, then it's a possibility to be fined, or there is a penalty for not implementing or enforcing the directive in the right way. But those fines are usually low, and it's also up to the member state to decide how to do it. And the whole legal concept is really to support them, guide them into doing the right thing, instead of putting asking them to pay something for it. But there is a possibility that if you don't follow the regulations, that it will cost you money.
Yeah. So the way the U.S. handles this for this law is that first you want to be able to sort of make a complaint or give feedback to the organization and say, I'm not able to use your get my car registered thing, and then if you don't get a response within a couple of weeks, then you can go ahead and make a complaint if it looks like the organization is not going to make a change. And the complaint follows a very predictable path that the Department of Justice has used in the past, starting with the organization, but can eventually go to the Department of Justice. And it means that generally the organization's got to do something about this. Certain number of, might be 120 days or something, I don't know exactly, to finalize it. But the important thing to understand is that no one makes money off of this. No one's going to sue a government agency and make any money. They might be able to get their attorney fees paid for. And so maybe the attorney is the only one that make any money. That one sues to get the system fixed. So the organization needs to fix it so it can be used, so it is accessible, so it does meet the standards and the requirements.
So on the enforcement, the Web Accessibility Directive is an EU legislation, but the monitoring is done at member state level. And this is also something that differs between the US and the EU, because here we do have somebody policing the public agencies to make sure that they're actually doing what they are supposed to do. So there is a specific way of monitoring. So we have a monitoring methodology. So there is an in-depth version that is done on a small number of websites and apps, and then there is a lighter version that is done on a larger number, just to have both the trends and the in-depth. So trying to do both quality and quantitatively in all member states. And the number of websites and apps and documents that are covered depends on the size of the member states, so it should be proportional. And when they have done this monitoring each year, this first year now that it's being done, then they are going to report it to the Commission, and the Commission can then decide to put more money or resources in sectors that don't do good, or regions that don't do good, or they can change the way the directive is working in another way based on this reporting. And right now the review of the Web Accessibility Directive is taking place, so that's very interesting. We're going to report in the 23rd of June next year, a combined report on what happened with all these, what's the status is in all different member states, and also what end users, policymakers, industry, and public sector agencies think about the Web Accessibility Directive. Does it meet its objectives, and is it efficient, and so on? So it's actually written in the legal text that it will be revised and that it should kind of continue to evolve. So that's, I think, it's also very kind of forward leaning in this. So the monitoring piece is one way of enforcement, and the other one is, of course, the accessibility statement. So kind of the self-declaration, that is where the public sector agencies that are covered by the legislation, they need to declare their level of accessibility, and that is then also checked during the monitoring. You can't just say anything. And the feedback and complaints, again, that's another, it's kind of the bottom-up perspective. So we have the monitoring going from top down, we have the self-declaration in the middle, people really telling how it is, this is the truth, hopefully, and then the user perspective also entering this. So these are kind of the three pieces of enforcement that makes the Web Accessibility Directive work, I hope.
I think the US is lagging behind in the monitoring aspect. What we have, as I said, the ICT procurement, so that acquisition protest, that's where a vendor can sue the government, or that they chose the wrong vendor because they knew that they had responded to this and given them their VPAT, and they know the VPAT because they're meant to be public of the other company, and they know their products better. And this has happened, and companies have won. And then individuals can make complaints and other types of legal action. But the only monitoring that really exists per se is this reporting that the US Attorney General from the Department of Justice is supposed to put together every 2 years and then present to Congress and the President. And it has not worked like that since 2001. I mean, there may be 5 times that they did that. I don't know about more recently because I haven't been inside the government more recently, but that was not done the way that it was supposed to be done. I know that. So I think we definitely fall behind in the monitoring.
So this is our last slide. I think I'll let Katie start here because she's behind the quote and the and the illustration.
Okay, so one ring to rule them all. I mean, if anyone is a J.R.R. Tolkien fan and have read The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, they will understand this. But in any case, this is a plan to rule them all. So this is our suggestion for global compliance. Do provide an accessibility statement. Do provide this way for people to give feedback and for people to get help, because basically people just want help. They don't want to have to go through some big, huge. And of course, that is where the rubber meets the road, that you are dealing directly with your customers, whether it's in social media, anywhere else, or someone calling in, or contacting you through the accessibility statement contact. This is really important to get that feedback and to be able to make changes. So I think that's vitally important. of course, use WCAG 2.1, right? If you are using WCAG 2.1, you are still meeting WCAG 2.0 in the United States. So if you're building ICT products or services and you want to be able to use it globally, use the higher requirement. Do use the usability standards for human factors. It's vitally important to make sure something is accessible and usable, right? Do utilize the authoring tool requirements from Section 508 because it only covers 4 aspects of the authoring tool regulation that's standard from the W3C, but it's the most important ones. The content that builds content. Is the tool accessible to someone using it and building content? Is the output accessible? And does it have templates for, for tables that are all accessible? They're just different ones, and templates for this and that, or your authoring environments. And then, that feedback loop. It's really, really important to have a conversation, say, we can make this change. We can do that in the next couple of sprints. And then always have regular testing. It is something that I think is necessary to have external bodies do an audit on a regular basis, once every couple of years or a year, to be sure that people can have faith in what you say is true about your product, and no one is expecting 100% compliance because that's just about impossible, but it's a goal to work towards, and we try. I would use the VPAT, the international version, if you want to be able to have one VPAT out there available for everyone to be able to utilize. And then, but any version would be better than nothing. And then, of course, users with disabilities. As far as I know, there's only one law in the United States that actually requires that. It's the Air Carriers Act, I believe, Air Carriers Accessibility Act. But it's really important for all of us to do, because how else are we really going to know? And so there are plenty of organizations that do this. If you don't have people on staff, I would utilize them. So that's sort of our, sort of plan. If you have an organization that has ICT products or services and you want to be sure to not have to build different things for different areas, this is our recommendation on the way to go.
Thank you, Katie. Just to add to the accessibility statements, so the EU way of doing accessibility statements, there is a template. So you also have the headings and you know exactly what to fill in. And I think that is both helpful for the organization, but it's also very useful for the end users because they know what to look for and where to look for it, and they can easily read it, provided that everyone uses the template. But that is required to use the template. So that's a good thing. And I think also that testing with users, we also do not have any regulations on the actual testing piece, but in the Web Accessibility Directive, the member states are required to include end users and their organizations in the transposition phase and also the implementation. So when they choose which websites are going to be monitored, for example, that is based on many different criteria, but one of them being the consultation with end users. So the end users are at least somewhat included in the regulatory framework in the EU. So, but I can't stress this enough. Of everything that Katie said, I think test with users is really, to me, the most important part. The rest you can, it helps you, but testing with users is what really makes the difference.
Yeah.
So thank you for that, Katie, and thanks for the good quote and the beautiful ring. We are open for questions. We are running a little bit late, but I think that's okay. I just want to spell out our email addresses if you would have any other questions or comments on this. So my email is really easy. It's my name, Susanna.Laurin, so SUSANNA.LAURIN at funka.com, which is funka.com. And Katie, with a beautiful last name, is, I don't know how to say, Ryladog, RILADOG at gmail.com. So you're more than welcome to contact any of us.
Yes.
So,
yes.
And now the sun is really, I wouldn't say it's disturbing, because sunshine is never disturbing, but it's kind of difficult for my eyes. So we have a couple of questions that I hope we can cover in the Q&A, so thank you for them. So I would like to have clarification about the authoring tool would not be covered in the Web Accessibility Directive. What is the definition of an authoring tool here, and where is it said that those aren't covered? So good question. I don't have a definition of authoring tools because that is not, there's nowhere written in the directive that this is what we call an authoring tool and this is why we are not covering it. But what is covered is really well defined, and that is websites, extranets, intranets, apps, and documents. So that means that the authoring tool is considered more of an internal system or a tool to make the website and apps and blah, blah, blah. So therefore that is not covered. So it's not that it's kind of pointed out as something that isn't covered, but it's just that it's not mentioned. So therefore it's not covered. And we are talking about here, I mean, if the authoring tool is not providing, when you create content, if the authoring tool is not providing accessible content, then you will have a problem because then your website won't be accessible. So it's much smarter to procure an authoring tool that provides accessible content, of course, but you don't have to do it. If you prefer to have a bad tool and then remediate afterwards, then that's up to you. And also, unfortunately, the backend or kind of the editor piece where the actual content is put into the system, that is unfortunately not covered in the legislation, only intranets, so not the separate internal systems yet. So that will come.
That's right. So for a specific definition of authoring tool, you could go to the W3C's authoring tool accessibility requirements, ATAG, and it lists what they are, but in general, you know, it's everything from SDKs for that generate code, to content management systems, to PDFs, Word, things like that, things that generate other content, code that generates other content, a UI that exists that does that. Let's go to the next question.
Yeah, so if a professor in the US adds a long 2,000-page, not accessible untagged PDF document to its course from a US professional organization, who is responsible for the remediation? The professor, the university, or the organization of the said professional? Are there any exemptions for the university?
Want to offer it in different versions. If you can't make it accessible, then you would provide a Word document that had been made accessible. You can provide it in different formats. And in fact, the best is to make an HTML version that's accessible. So that's what I would recommend, and that's what you'll find at government agencies. Usually a lot of different options, but at least one of them has got to be accessible. And the responsibility, who gets sued is the actual body that displays this for others to utilize. So in this case, it would be the university itself who's responsible legally, but who needs to fix it? It may be that the university has a policy that says you need to make sure you send this to the accessibility IT people and make sure that they make it accessible before we post it. That would be the thing that would make sense. Next.
Yeah, it would be the same in the EU. It would be the university's responsibility, and then who is doing the remediation? Well, that depends on the contract. If you have contracted a supplier and written a good contract, then they should do it. But it's the responsibility of the university, definitely. So next one is, how does the differences between the EU and US affect global organizations that do business in both regions but headquartered in one of them, I guess? So
I think I can tell you from a US perspective, you need to take into account that Europe uses multiple languages, and the language requirements and being able to have this information, whatever it may be, in multiple languages is a very important thing to consider and to ensure that you have, because having it accessible in one language is not adequate for Europe, whereas in the United States, generally it is.
Yeah, good point. So from the EU perspective, this hasn't really been tried yet because the current legislation only covers public sector, and public sector don't have offices in other countries because they are national. So this will be very interesting, and we have been discussing this quite a lot recently when the European Accessibility Act enters into force, because that is the whole chain of the value chain of products and services. So manufacturers, importers, distributions, blah, blah, blah. So that would be then very interesting to see what happens with this whole value chain and where we can put the blame, so to speak. So let me come back to you after 2025 and when that has been tested in real life, so to speak. But good question. And of course, if we have, when we have clients who do business in both, private sector clients who do business on both sides of the Atlantic, we always say follow the highest recommendations and the highest rules, because then you cover both. So more of them are coming in. Would like to hear Susanna's opinion on the US international VPAT for communicating accessibility of a product to EU customers? That is a long answer to that one. We are not, well, if I try to answer on a more high level than my own opinion, there is a discussion about the use of VPAT or not in the EU. It doesn't really fit our tradition or how we usually do things. And it hasn't been really popular. I know many different organizations have tried to kind of implement VPATs. It's not very, it exists, but it's quite rare. So I don't think it really fits with how we are, normally doing things, but definitely something similar to it, I think, will appear sooner or later here as well, because that will be necessary, especially when the European Accessibility Act enters into force, because that covers also products. Nowadays, it's more when you buy a website, the VPAT isn't that helpful because you buy something that doesn't exist. So you really, essentially, you buy a partner to help you develop something that will exist in the future, and then I think the VPAT is not as efficient. But it's a good question. I'm happy to discuss it more in depth, but it's kind of a hard policy-wise to do it. But I can assure you that the Commission and the WADEX members are discussing how to move about on this, and there are also some national projects or initiatives around how to do this, but procurement is done differently in different member states, so it's hard to give an answer for everyone. So what are your opinion on the ISO 300711 in the context of the EN 301549? I don't know really what to answer to that one, so please reach out afterwards and I'll try to have a conversation on it. I don't know, Katie, if you have.
I'll say about that particular one, I don't know, but I do know that certain countries have to have an ISO standard to point to, which is why WCAG is also an ISO standard, went to that trouble to do. And so I'm not sure if that is the kind of thing that will address it. As Susanna said, Europe has to point to its own standard as opposed to an ISO standard. So.
Okay, thank you. So we need to wrap up soon, but I have never seen a complaint link. Is it in this directive or it will be in the next one? So that is in the Web Accessibility Directive. It's required in the implementation acts, and in the template for the accessibility statement, it says that each of the public sector agencies that are covered by the directive need to provide a link to the complaints mechanism. So that is something that should be seen and should be existing, and it's a little bit worrying if someone in the EU doesn't seem to find it. So that would also be very interesting also for the review that we are performing on behalf of the Commission right now. If you could reach out to me afterwards, I would be happy to get more information about that. Maybe that's a specific region or level of agencies that are not providing it. So thank you for that question. So I think we need to move on to ending this. Rachel, if you want to take over.
I just want to point out that what they've put here is that there appears to be something on authoring tools in the annex table A1. Thank you for that information.
Oh, sorry, I missed the last one.
That's it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you all for attending.
So Rachel is not coming in. I put Rachel to the...
This is Rachel. I'm here again. Thank you, Susanna and Katie, for the great presentation today. Just again, posted in the chat is a link to join the follow-up informal drop-in session that will happen on November 9th, and that is at 4 o'clock Central European time, or 10 o'clock for anyone here, at 10 o'clock Eastern, anyone in the US. The link is posted in the chat.
And at those drop-ins that we are always kind of connecting them to the previous webinar, but anyone is also welcome to join and just talk about IAAP, ask about the member benefits or certification or anything. We are always having IAAP staff in the drop-in, so it's kind of a service for the EU members and people in the EU who want to become members, of course, and because this is kind of covering both the EU and the US, I hope we will also get some people from outside of the EU joining those webinars. So it's now 3 o'clock in Sweden, at least. So let's thank Katie a lot for this. Thank you to all to the interpreters. Thanks, Rachel, for setting all this technology up. And thank you, everyone who has been listening to this. Thank you for joining us. Please stay tuned for all the other EU webinars that we are carrying out. We do have 3 more webinars before the end of the year, and we will have a specific event in the European Week of People with Disabilities, so on the 30th of November, so stay tuned for more information on that as well. And we have a newsletter, but I guess you know that. If you haven't subscribed to the EU topical newsletter, please do.
Excellent. Thank you very much, everybody. I really enjoyed it. I know it's really boring stuff for some people, but it's important information for other people for their jobs. So thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.